Let's begin with a silent meditation. Although at one level of our planet there is a single underlying planetary lineage, we've been talking somewhat about the reality that in the physical world especially, but even to some extent in the inner dimensions, that one lineage ultimately reflects in a variety of different sort of sublineages. At a fairly deep level, those sublineages are still very comprehensive or universal, and there's only a handful of them at that level. And then those differentiate further into more schools, more traditions, more religious. And to a large extent, that reflects regional differences. The fact that, especially historically, until somewhat more modern times, there's been a certain geographical influence where it's inevitable that as the Dharma is focused in different parts of the world or unfolds within the context of different cultures, it will take on its own unique characteristics that in part are influenced by that culture. There is a certain, actually a fairly good amount of cycling around in the world in the sense of souls that move from one culture to another, so that there's a kind of not only physical cross-fertilization, because traditions in the world on the physical plane do interact. For instance, Pythagoras went to India and absorbed a lot of influence from Indian spirituality. It's widely thought that he not only went to India, but in more esoteric circles, it's been put forth that he was directly initiated into deeper Indian mysteries and brought those influences back to India, and there was a sort of ongoing flow back and forth. Clearly, we see in Plato and Socrates' teachings, and later in the Neoplatonic schools, Plotinus and Iamblichus, we see this strong Eastern flavor to their spirituality. So, and part of that was physically transmitted. Part of it is that, regardless of the different regional separations, there has been at least some interaction. We have in the Native American traditions, once there was a kind of migration into the Americas beginning 10 or 15,000 years ago at least, there was somewhat of an isolation there, and so there's a very specific and unique flavor to Native American spirituality throughout the Americas, North, Central, and South. But in other parts of the world, there's been more kind of ongoing interaction. But that also takes place on the inner levels too, where somebody may be deeply trained in a specific region of the world, and then in another subsequent incarnation incarnate into another area of the world or within the context of a different tradition, and often bring some of that flavor through so that they kind of cross-fertilize each other in these ways. In a sense, that's all part of a process of expanding and enriching the Dharma as it expresses throughout all the cultures of the world, gradually moving in the direction of actually expressing in physical incarnation within the human kingdom an increasingly global and comprehensive and integral planetary spirituality, planetary lineage. But of course, that's a huge project in the sense that to truly express what could be called the Shambhala lineage or the planetary Dharma, both in terms of the scope and richness of the teachings, as well as in developing initiates in the world that embody that kind of richness, and have that mature in such a way as that it sort of gradually inundates the world's spiritual traditions and cultures to such an extent that it's more widely recognized as a more universal dharma, and the sort of lineage behind that dharma, the deepest dimensions of it, have a more universal recognition as well. That obviously is many hundreds and in fact thousands of years into the future as that kind of continues to mature and grow. One of the things that happens to, a challenge that in many mystics face is that it's one thing to contact dimensions of reality that are transcendental, that are timeless, that are infinite, that are formless and expansive and transcendent. But when some of these visionary experiences turn into a sense of a story that's happening in the world, then the challenge, a major challenge that mystics face is having a realistic sense of the timing. Like, it's one thing, for instance, to enter a more intuitive state and have a vision of a unified humanity that lives in much more profound harmony and a kind of global spirit of one humanity, and that's deeply integrated with the planet, with nature and the other kingdoms as well. And then in our idealism, in the physical world, we might, say, well, that I just had this vision. This must be right around the corner. Maybe within the next 50 years, this will be happening. Well, that's a mistake of integrating that vision back into time and appreciating the karmic reality of where are we actually at in that story of actualizing that vision. Maybe that's something that's seated at the heart of all human kingdoms, the potential to reach a level of enlightenment that would naturally cause such a deep integration and harmonization within humanity as a whole. But we've already been at this for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, and obviously more time is going to be needed to bring about something like that. So, in a sense, that's part of what we're talking about when we talk about the significance of a planetary lineage. Although on a very practical level, it's also just part of a maturing spirituality that, although humanity as a whole may not be ready in the immediate, say within our lifetimes, or in immediate future generations' lifetimes, but that doesn't mean there isn't a growing number of people in the world that are attuned to this idea and are beginning to actualize. That's inevitable first stage of the process, is attuning to that and having that begin to express in different ways through individuals. And one of the ways it's been expressing in the world so far is not just as a kind of general spirit of something that specific individuals experience as intuitives, as visionaries, as mystics, and so on. And then to varying degrees can embody that in their own lives. But it also is something that that's one of the basic meanings that we are sharing when we talk about the notion of a Shambhala lineage, is that it's to the extent that there are communities of spiritual initiates or practitioners around the world that we're, for instance, often referring to as hidden. Very often they're hidden masters. They share a strong sense of community and group vision. But because the world's not really ready for this just yet, for the most part, they work behind the scenes. And so we hear about them through, for instance, there's a, excuse me, a funny story in a book by Ram Dass about Neem Kroli Baba. It's called Miracle of Love, and it's Ram Dass and some other disciples of Neem Karoli Baba, a great 20th century Hindu saint. Ram Dass and some other disciples gathered a bunch of anecdotal stories of his students' experiences with Neem Karoli Baba. And in one of them, a Hindu student of Neem Karoli had been talking to some mysterious sadhu who had a lot of knowledge about the notion that there was this hidden group of masters behind the scenes, and even a whole kind of hierarchy of them, and including a kind of head that was sort of like the world teacher, world guru, sort of a chief or king of the earth, you know, in a sort of spiritual sense. And so he was having these conversations, this disciple of Neem Karoli was having these conversations with this other master. And one time he had Neem Karoli over to his house, and Neem Karoli came into his room and he saw a picture of this sadhu that had been sharing this sort of esoteric lore with the student of Neem Karoli's. And immediately Neem Karoli Baba got upset, and he said, why have you been talking to this person, and why have you been drawing out of him this information about these masters? He's not supposed to be talking about that secret knowledge, and he's talking too much, and you're making him talk, and you guys should stop talking about this. And so, you know, the person was startled. He didn't even tell Neem Karoli anything about it. Neem Karoli just understood. Seeing his picture brought the whole thing out. And later, the student had an opportunity to ask him, well, was it true? And he said, yes, of course it's true. There are these beings, but we don't talk about this. And that's the way it's been for thousands of years in various parts of the world. These masters have existed largely behind the scenes. Of course, there's a permeability to that veil. They do interact with humanity, but it's generally not in a public way. In other words, sometimes they might send members of their group out into the world, and they become a Shankara or a Buddha or Lao Tse or Jesus. But for the most part, the senior-most masters of this planetary lineage work behind the scenes, because their specialty is being part of a kind of, in a sense, there's several reasons they're behind the scenes. One of them is because they have a very large vision of planetary evolution, and they implement that in a variety of ways, including that they may not be public figures, but that doesn't mean they're not interacting with individuals. So, for instance, one of them might make contact with some great master like Lao Tzu, and so Lao Tzu is incarnated in the world, and then one of these masters will make contact with Lao Tzu and initiate him into this deeper knowledge and vision and practice, empowering them in that way. And then Lao Tzu is instructed not to talk about that, so we never hear that this has happened. Occasionally we do. And in this way, these masters have a very profound influence on the world without being recognized as that's what's happening. Another method, of course, that they use is to work with people internally. More often than not, their contact with their students takes place subjectively through inspiration. They help in the inner planes. They help a student or an initiate in that lineage to sort of design or plan an incarnation. They come into the world, and then they have a sort of hidden or invisible influence on that person's life, helping to orchestrate different things unfolding, helping them meet different people, or giving them inspiration about what their life work is, guiding them to spiritual teachers, all of these kinds of things. And in this way, their influence is very extensive in the world, but it's largely unrecognized. And part of the depth of this, the significance of this group, is that they're they're kind of specialists in understanding the big picture. They understand the history of the Earth, and they have a deep understanding of the general future direction of humanity and the Earth. And they also are very aware of the times. They may not be out in the world, say, for instance, just because a master may live in China or in the mountains of South America or in Tibet or India, say 200 years ago, doesn't mean they're not aware of things that are happening all around the world. They're often aware of advances of science that are taking place, or cultural movements, of political situations arising in different countries around the world, and they work to express a spiritual influence over these events and developments, not just with regard to the spiritual traditions of the world, but also with regard to all aspects of culture. There's a very profound way in which the work of this group is deeply connected to all aspects of culture. One way to think about this, incidentally, is the chakras in a human being have a wide variety of meanings or significances. For instance, on a more physiological level, chakras are related to the different organs of the body and spread prana or life force to these different organs immediately around them. And so there's a significance with regard to it, sort of part of the subtle anatomy of the body, how the life force moves in the body, how it maintains health in the body, how it facilitates healing, how it energizes our lives, it regulates and influences metabolism and digestion and heart rate and sexuality and cycles and menstruation and all the hormones in our system, in our nervous system, are all affected in a very physiological way by the chakras. And so our spiritual and psychological and energetic condition is reflected in our body and influences our health, our vitality, our level of sleep patterns, all of these things. Well, there's other levels of meaning in the chakras as well, as we all know. And at one level, another dimension of the chakras that's less often spoken of is that it reflects macrocosmic and mesocosmic, if you will, dimensions of reality, so that we can know the larger world around us by the depth to which we not only understand our own microcosm, which includes our body and our chakras, but also use that as a kind of mirror to experience how the larger world around us is reflected in those chakras. And one of the sort of intermediate larger realities, a very profound and intimate meaning of that, is the planet that we're a part of. So the different levels of consciousness of the planet are also reflected in our chakras. Now, there's different ways to experience this. The way I'm going to describe right now is one specific way. It's a very important way. It's not the only way, but it is an important and natural way. And that is that the various kingdoms in nature and in spiritual kingdoms are reflected in the chakras in this way. The mineral kingdom is reflected in our root chakra, the vegetable kingdom in our sacral center, the second chakra, the animal kingdom in the solar plexus, the human kingdom in the heart center, and then there's essentially three spiritual kingdoms that are reflected in the head centers, including the throat, kind of. It's sort of part of the upper triad, you might say. Now, this is a rich science, and perhaps we could go into it in more detail at some other time, but the gist of these three the way these three kingdoms are reflected in the higher chakras is that once somebody passes through the first initiation, and this has parallels in other kingdoms, but it's more or less specifically also related to the human kingdom, so we'll look at it in that way. In one sense, the person is still human, but in another sense, they've kind of, something has happened in the inner nature of a human being, their soul, when they pass through the first initiation. That's, you know, essentially a kind of an initiation into a new way of being. You know, remember how the Buddha, for instance, referred to the first initiation as entering the stream. The realization, the truth of nirvana, the truth of God, or our own direct participation in the ground of being, the interrelatedness of all life, becomes an awakened realization in the soul of all people who pass through the first initiation. Now, depending on their spiritual path and how this took place, their physical personality may or may not have a direct experience of that realization at that moment of transition, but their soul does. And so that awakening, that the lighting of that fire can never be taken away. They're now a new kind of being. And in this model that we're talking about, which is based on a kind of a particular way of understanding the chakras, there's other ways as well, but you know, we won't complicate things too much right now by trying to include that. We'll just say that from this particular point of view, that kingdom is kind of reflected in the human being in the throat center. And then through a series of initiations, a person eventually passes through the fifth initiation, at which point they graduate from that kingdom into what could be called a sixth kingdom. By the way, one person who more or less said something very similar to this was Sri Yukteswar, Yogananda's guru, in his book, The Holy Science. And he called this kingdom Devata. You know, it's sort of based on the same word as like Deva, but the way he was using it here is not the theosophical term. Deva, unfortunately, has been used in a variety of different ways by different groups, and even in different ways within the same tradition. The way it's being used here is not quite the same way as in theosophy, or even in the Buddhist tradition, for instance, which is yet another way. It's used specifically to mean just somebody who's kind of a spiritually awake being. And then Sri Yukteswar's name for the next kingdom, he didn't relate them to the chakras the way I am, but he laid out these kingdoms in a very similar fashion. And this, in a sense, you could say the sixth kingdom in nature is the kingdom of liberated beings. And if these beings continue to come back into the world, then they're, you know, we'll call them bodhisattvas, or so in a sense you could say this is the kingdom of bodhisattvas, especially as far as, you know, those who are still participating in our planet and reincarnating. So here you might say that at the essence of what beings at this level of consciousness on a planetary level are embodying is pure intuitive realization of spiritual wisdom and virtues. Especially, it's important to sort of understand that, that's one of the reasons we see, for instance, in certain teachings, like some of the Western esoteric teachings, and these are reflected in other traditions as well, like in Tibetan Buddhism or Hinduism. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's versions of this where there are qualities associated with different individuals, so that, for instance, we see a theosophical teaching like masters being on different rays. But sort of like this is the level at which those rays are, you know, when we're looking at the chakras from a planetary point of view, that's how the planets reflect. This is sort of like the level where a person is working through their outer form, they're going through different stages of spiritual development. And at this level, they penetrate into a realm of pure luminosity. And formless intuitive wisdom and spiritual qualities. And so we could call that the kingdom of masters, of liberated bodhisattvas. And then from this point of view, Shambhala would be at the crown. Shambhala can be looked at from different points of view, but in this model, Shambhala is in the crown center. So one of the reasons I'm mentioning this understanding is because it helps a little bit to understand what the hidden masters are doing, how they function, you might say, in that humanity, in this view, is essentially in the middle. It's a state of consciousness and an experience of evolution, of growth, a way of being that is in between the more awakened spiritual realms and the more unconscious samsaric dimensions, the nature kingdoms. I'm not talking about the intelligences that work through nature, the archangelic hierarchies, that's something different. But the actual life forms that are in nature, in many ways, are much like us. They're part of samsara too. They're suffering. They have an urge to be happy. And what happens when beings enter the human kingdom is that urge to be happy becomes more self-conscious, and it's possible to understand, to learn about things like the Dharma, and so kind of new, in a sense, the human beings in between the Dharma and identification with samsara, and they're working that out. They're learning to tell the difference between the two. And once that contrast between those two realities, truth and samsara, develops enough in them to the sense that they awaken to a vivid orientation towards pursuing the Dharma, then in a sense that person has graduated from being sort of ordinary human to being an awakened human. That's kind of what the throat center means. But another expression of the throat center is, and it's an expression of creativity. It's the expressive center, you might say. It's a center where spiritual ideals and transcendent realization radiate into the world and are expressed in different ways. So this is essentially, one way to look at it is from a human point of view. This is Shambhala, these are the bodhisattvas, and this is culture. This is the dimension in which the ideals of spiritual wisdom and ideals of the deep Dharma takes form in a variety of ways that can be expressed in culture, in science, in education, in the arts, in literature, in philosophies, so that those tools, those cultural patterns can be used as a way to help awaken humanity. So one form that initiates take when they're passing through this realm is that they're spiritual practitioners, and they engage in various kinds of spiritual practice, and they make progress through the different stages of awakening. But another form, another aspect of the expression of this kingdom in the world is that it is often an expression of people that, because of their different stages of spiritual awakening, they engage in forms of service that take the form of culture. And of course, what I mean by this is enlightened culture. There's ways in which all of these things, science, art, philosophy, can come under the influence of people that aren't awakened. And so often their influences aren't very positive. There are philosophies that are very confused. There are so-called artistic expressions in the world that aren't very truly inspired or artistic. They express more of the confusion or the struggles or the sort of misguided philosophical ideas or emotions of that specific individual, rather than something that is more enlightened and more helpful to humanity. So this aspect of the human kingdom that I'm talking about in this context is when awakened individuals, people with some degree of spiritual maturity engage in culture. That's what if the world was dominated by that influence, we'd have an enlightened culture in the world, and then civilization as a whole would be very much guided by and inspired by an enlightened culture instead. Obviously, when we look around at the culture that we have in the world now, it's not adequately infused with this more dharmic or spiritual influence. So we have a kind of mixed culture with a whole spectrum of kinds of influences. So in this context, many of the masters that have achieved full liberation from the human kingdom, in a sense, are kind of entering into the brow and crown chakras of the planet, and they kind of move behind the scenes, and they work to both initiate individuals and guide individuals who are going through the deeper mystical traditions of the world and gaining different levels of enlightenment. And they also work to inspire culture, because that's a deep way in which the influence of the Dharma takes different forms that help to shape culture and also inspire people and guide people throughout the human kingdom as a whole, especially people, for instance, that aren't necessarily ready for a deeper spiritual practice. But they can be influenced positively by good literature, good art, sustainable and holistic sciences, good medicine, good political understandings and visions, philosophical ideas, and so on. All of these are also part of the curriculum in a sense of the human kingdom, and so culture is an important part of that. And, so this is one of the reasons too. You might say that in that sense, the spiritual community of the planet has three main dimensions. And it's almost as if this is the spirit of the crown center is Shambhala. Its primary vibration is non-dual presence. It's the transcendental reality, that deeply unifying, unbiased, integral reality. You might say it's planetary Atman or planetary Rigpa. And then this is a level of luminosity, of wisdom, of virtue, of spiritual ideals. And this is a level at which they become expressed. This is almost like the personality embodied active expression of the Dharma in the world, both as spiritual practice as well as engagement of those qualities and expression of that vision in the world in its various forms. So in many ways, one of the functions of the deeper masters, the hidden masters behind the scenes, is they have that larger vision. They're sort of like the guiding, more informed inspiration behind the active element of the Dharma. Yes, exactly, Tamara, like the three kayas, Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, and Nirmanakaya. So, another aspect of how the Shambhala lineage unfolds in the world then is that at the deepest levels of our planet and beyond, there's a much more deeply unified vision. But as that vision works out in the world through specific initiatives, through different schools of thought and different cultures and different spiritual lineages, it invariably kind of fragments into different subdivisions, and some of that is absolutely essential and natural. But it also has some negative side effects sometimes, in the sense that the incarnate personalities, for instance, of participants in all the different cultural and spiritual expressions in the world, can develop biases where they have a partial inspiration, a partial view, but then they can become over-identified with that particular point of view, that particular tradition. There's something I call lineage ego. That's where a person may, in fact, actually be fairly advanced in other respects in terms of transcending their own attachments and self-interest. But then they can sometimes, and it's fairly frequent actually, as far as I can see, will transfer some of that into a more subtle form where they have a distinct favoritism towards their own tradition. So they end up getting into, like for instance, it's not uncommon, I've noticed this in the spiritual teachings of a number of different teachers that I've had either personal contact with or encountered in my readings and so on, where sometimes they'll make a case as to why their particular practice is the highest practice, and often there's some kind of truth in their understanding, in the sense that a lot of practices have an essential essence to them, a core that can bring a person to very deep levels of enlightenment. And sometimes, and very often, a specific practice can actually be a particularly suitable way, in fact, a sort of an ideal way for certain kinds of people to attain that state. So in that context, yes, it's sort of a highest practice for those people, but it's not necessarily for everybody. And so if such an individual develops that kind of bias that this practice or this philosophy or this religious tradition is the highest, there's a danger there of that being kind of an attachment or a bias, or that will limit that person's ability to have a broader, more universal perception. So a basic challenge that we face as the world moves towards understanding and embodying the planetary lineage is overcoming these biases that are pervasive, really, as far as I can see. Even in many who are participating in these webinars right now are aware of, have come from a background of some kind of familiarity with some of the modern expressions of the so-called planetary lineages, certain specific ones like the trans-Himalayan lineage. But even there, what we've seen from a pretty early stage in the process, which began back in the 19th century, of trying to communicate something of the spirit of this lineage and its vision for humanity, is that it immediately began to fracture into different subgroups who had different interpretations of it and often were in conflict with each other. So immediately within 20 or 30 years, you have subgroups within the Theosophical Society, for instance, entering into increasing disagreement with each other. Then you have individuals splitting off. You have people like Steiner deciding that he didn't really like Eastern spirituality that much. He thought that Christianity was superior, so he went another way. Then you have Roerich saying, well, I think Blavatsky's original vision was the right one, so I'm going to stick with that, but I'm going to give it another spin and talk about Maitreya and Agni Yoga and the future kind of emergent Dharma. There's even other people that weren't directly outgrowths of Theosophy, like Aurobindo. They give it their own spin. Aurobindo tended to favor Hinduism, didn't look as favorably upon some of the other traditions like Buddhism. Then you later have Daskalos, and you have Leadbeater and Besant splitting off, and Alice Bailey splitting off. And so already within 50 or 100 years, the initial impulse of it trying to express something about a unified planetary lineage has turned into a dozen or more subgroups, many of them having disagreements with each other about what it's all about, sometimes even just completely denouncing each other and saying they're completely wrong. This is the human way. These are the issues we have to work with in dealing with, coming to a place where we have a true planetary vision. And frankly, I think one of the things that this tells us, it's a little bit sobering, and grounding is, well, the karmic reality of where humanity is at is we're not really profoundly ripe on a large scale in humanity to give birth to a profound recognition of a planetary dharma, a more universal spirituality. We're in the very early stages of that. And even the first attempts to do that in the last 150 years or so have met with a lot of challenges, a lot of resistance, a lot of backlash reactions. In fact, it's interesting to observe that a main source that this came from, it's not, incidentally, it's not just the Theosophical Society around the same time period. There were other individuals who were working a little bit with this same impulse. One of those was Ramalinga, a Hindu sage. Well, and speaking of the Hindus, even Ramakrishna had some of this impulse, and he had the inspiration to, once he had attained a deep realization within the Hindu tradition, he decided to set it aside and just essentially become a Christian. He threw himself wholeheartedly into just embracing the Christian path, and then realizing God consciousness through that path. And then he set that aside and he embraced Islam and did the same thing there and attained God consciousness through, and then stepped back from all three and said, they're different styles, but they all led me to the same place. So I think the underlying truth of religion points at the same reality. And somebody that's kind of in that spirit is contributing to helping to kind of work towards revealing a deeper, more universal spirituality in the world. Ramalinga also tried to start a kind of universal community, rejected the caste system, and enunciated the notion of a kind of more universal, non-sectarian spirituality. And his followers didn't really quite get it. He was a very sort of unusual person in certain ways, and they became sort of more distracted by that and kind of focused more on him as a personality and less on embodying the ideals he was teaching. So that didn't go as far as he hoped. And then, in fact, in 1874, he predicted that another group of masters in the north of India would try again. And he said a Russian woman will come and work with some Americans and others, and probably a more successful attempt at what I just tried will happen. He envisioned that before he left incarnation. And then the next year, the Theosophical Society was founded. But again, it's interesting to know that the chief, so-called, the Mahachokan, as he's often called, this master who is often less talked about in sort of Western esoteric circles, though he was actually a very important figure, because he was in fact the head of that trans-Himalayan sublineage of the Planetary lineage that had its headquarters in Tibet, but also another major center in the Middle East. When Kutumi and Maurya, who were the main influences behind founding the Theosophical Society, came to their master, the Mahachokan, with this idea, he said, well, it's okay if you want to try, but I don't think the time is ripe yet, so I don't think it's going to work out very well, but you can go ahead and try. And to many of us, in retrospect, we can see why he said that, because in fact, in many ways, it didn't turn out to be what was hoped for it. The basic idea got communicated, and very many positive things came about through not only the Theosophical Society, but the many other things that grew out of that in the last century and plus. But in many ways, it simply wasn't, it didn't fulfill the vision that was hoped for. That's a whole other conversation in itself, but briefly, one of the things I'll point out is, for instance, it fractured into a lot of subdivisions, as I just briefly indicated earlier, some of whom were not particularly getting along very well, even within the Theosophical Society. There's several main subdivisions that have, in some ways, some pretty significant disagreements about the whole spirit and vision of theosophy. And then we have other individuals who just split off from it. Alice Bailey, Steiner, Daskalos. Daskalos was very influenced by theosophy, but similarly felt the need to go in a different direction. Another thing that we see not working out really as ideally as planned was Krishnamurti. Krishnamurti was hoped to be an expression of the same spirit, and in a very kind of pure and essential way, he did fulfill that something there. One of these very essential aspects of Krishnamurti's Dharma that we do see coming out and expressing powerfully in his teachings was, remember that part of this movement into the new cycle that we've talked about is a shift from a kind of higher mind causal emphasis in the hierarchies and expression in the world and the spiritual traditions in the world to a more fundamentally non-dual mysticism, a movement, like as Bailey referred to it, a shift from the hierarchies kind of lens of focus in relationship to humanity, from being on the causal body or higher mental plane to the purely intuitive plane. Aurobindo talked about this as moving from overmind to supermind. We see this as a kind of recurring theme. And so part of what the energy behind Krishnamurti's work was is a kind of a Shiva-like impulse to kind of cut through the old way. So he rejected, ironically, he rejected a lot of the teachings of theosophy. Kind of on the surface rejected the masters. He rejected the notion that Maitreya was going to be working through. In many ways, what he rejected was the distortions of theosophy, some of the immaturities in how people were relating to all that, because he was surrounded by a lot of people that weren't terribly mature in how they were understanding all of that. But he also, I think deep down was inspired. But in fact, he acknowledged throughout his life, when he talked to friends and on a sort of more private level, that there was a presence that continued to work through him his whole life. It was this sort of Krishnamurti project, as we might call it, continued to take place throughout his life. And Krishnamurti did have a strong impact on a large number of people. But he a little bit threw the baby out with the bathwater. It wasn't so much a kind of tantric transformation of the old vision into a new one with a deeper foundation. He kind of rejected certain patterns, certain ways. When he said things like truth is a pathless land. Well, when you're in a state of non-dual presence, that's true. But the path to that state of presence is something that needs to be understood by our relative consciousness and engaged in as a spiritual practice. You don't just suddenly leap over the path and land in a state of non-dual presence. Occasionally that does happen, but it's very rare, and one could argue that there's probably lifetimes of spiritual practice before that. So even then, there's still a path that the person has been engaged in. So there's always a relative practical aspect of the Dharma. Krishnamurti was a little less keen on, a statement like truth is a pathless land, or emphasizing the notion of choiceless awareness. It's a very piercing, more non-dual kind of teaching, but it's not very helpful to the average practitioner. So in that sense, Krishnamurti's effect was somewhat mixed, and it really wasn't exactly what the plan was. And again, the reason for that is because, well, obviously the world situation we're in now is a challenging one, and the masters simply were seeing what they could try to bring about as early on as possible. The Mahachohan was sort of suggesting, well, perhaps we just kind of need to wait till things ripen more. Then, as we reveal some of these deeper truths to the world, it'll 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 integrate with the world. It'll take a form that's more mature because humanity is riper. But there's always a balance. That's sort of like you might have almost sort of put it in mundane terms as like an ongoing debate within the spiritual intelligences that work with evolution on different levels. What is the middle path between waiting for something to be ripe and perhaps overemphasizing that principle and just really being laid back about sharing the Dharma and having an impact on the world and just waiting for the world to sort of come to you, so to speak, and deeply ripen and be fully, maximally ready, versus the other end of the spectrum is really kind of hastening evolution more quickly, bringing that healing, bringing that awakening. And the danger in that is when it's premature. It can be that there's not enough ripeness to receive that inspiration, that energy, that stimulation, that support, that even that healing. So there's a great wisdom that needs to develop and is, has developed for thousands of years in spiritual lineages of what's the middle path there between a too intense approach and a too laid back approach. One version of that the Buddha talked about is the difference between extreme asceticism, which is intense forcing, a very willful approach, and overindulged self-indulgence, which is being too laid back about embracing the Dharma. But that middle path is not only an issue that's faced by the individual practitioner and how to engage in their own path, it's also a question that's faced by the planetary masters and how they relate to humanity, how they relate to specific individuals. With Krishnamurti, they used a very dynamic approach. They saw the horrors of the 20th century, the world wars coming, the depression, the conflicts between different religions and ecological crisis. There was a certain sense of the looming of these karmic clouds over humanity and the ongoing strife. And out of compassion, they thought, well, let's try. When they worked with Krishnamurti, for instance, they applied a very strong transmission of energy that he experienced as challenging, that he ended up calling the process, and caused a very strong Kundalini awakening that was rigorous and went on his entire life, constantly sort of stretching the boundaries, looking for that, how far can we go with this? How much energy can we put into the world through this person to help humanity? And trying to keep that balance, trying to sort of not go too far with that kind of thing. So there is a way in which, at all times in the activity of the planetary lineage, that there are these questions of, what methods to use? How should we go about this? When is it ripe to do this? When is it too soon? And partially it's experimental. Partially the plan is implemented in a way in which it's simply tests are done. One individual might be selected to be supported in such a way that their spiritual development is accelerated very rigorously. And it's an experiment to see, how will this work out? Maybe we can accomplish something here that would bring about a healing and an awakening, a resolution sooner than it would happen if we just let things take their natural course. And in other areas, they might lean in the opposite direction and have a more gentle, steady, foundational approach where you kind of know that you're approaching that project in such a way as laying a very firm foundation. It's going to work out. We've done this many times before. It's less experimental, but it's also, in some ways, may have a less profound impact. And then, of course, there's middle kind of approaches. It's kind of like if you have an investment, people who have stock portfolios. If you're kind of like, say, middle-aged, or even in your 30s, the advice is commonly, well, spread out your portfolio, have some very secure investments, have some middle-ish ones, and then have some risky ones. And if those pay off, that's great. But you're younger, so you don't have to, take some losses. You can still recover. So it's okay to take some risks over here. Then, as you get older, you get more conservative, so that you don't risk damaging your portfolio. It's literally as if one of the ways that the masters look at the plan is they have high risk ventures, they have medium risk ones, and they have low risk ones. The low risk ones don't mean that there isn't something very profoundly spiritual taking place there. It's just like, for instance, when the masters planned to send Yogananda to the West, that was a relatively low risk venture. Yogananda had been an initiate for many lifetimes. He was a very substantial and grounded initiate. He was trained personally by a very advanced master and brought to a very solid level of spiritual development, and then sent to the West. The risk aspect of it was not so much in Yogananda's character and whether he would succeed. It was more, how's the world going to relate to him? He's going to a different part of the world where the Dharma is not as well established. He's going to be in a place that he's not familiar with culturally. So it's not clear exactly how this is going to work out. So perhaps this is in some ways more of a kind of middle-ish. It's Yogananda himself was low risk, but the project was kind of middle-ish. Whereas Krishnamurti was a kind of a higher risk project in the sense that, for instance, Krishnamurti didn't have a physical teacher to give him a more substantial training and ensure a more grounded and mature understanding of the Dharma. He was essentially trained by other people, most of whom didn't have physical teachers either, like Leadbeater. So it's kind of like, well, we'll see what we can do with this situation, but we don't have the highest expectations that this is going to work out great. We'll put good energy through this person, and there'll always be some kind of value to the process and the experiment, but we're not necessarily expecting a new spiritual movement to emerge, like, the same way Guru Nanak started the Sikh tradition or something. Unlikely that Krishnamurti was going to generate some kind of powerful world movement that would take on that kind of momentum and have that kind of influence on it. It's too high risk a project, but it still had a value. But the reason I'm bringing all this up is to try to help strengthen a kind of realistic, grounded understanding of, yes, we have these lofty visions and ideals of what's possible in the world, and we're working in connection with this planetary lineage that's trying to foster this. But we're also at a very early stage of that process, and there's a lot of challenges that we face. And so we have to be patient about this and realistic about the timing, and not be impatient and not be naive about how long this is going to take and the steps that we need to go through along the way. So Tamara asks, so it didn't work, and now when we really need it, they aren't trying to send us anyone. Well, that's an interest. I know that's partially a joke, but to treat it as an actual question too. In fact, the work is ongoing. There's still individuals in the world that are expressing this spirit, but the plan has to adapt. The plan has to accommodate changes, and so we'll actually come back to some of that more. Like, we'll bring that up to a kind of current sense of, like, what is the work of the planetary lineage in the world, and especially with regard to how it's supporting the emergence of a new Dharma in the world. We'll return to that after our break. So I'll take that question up a little more fully then. yes, when Krishnamurti was essentially taught by Leadbeater. Leadbeater wasn't a liberated master, though. So what I meant was, like in Yogananda's case, for instance, he got to be trained by Sri Yukteswar, who was a liberated master, whereas Leadbeater was not. Yes, Lena has a question. Let me unmute here. So, okay.
Okay. Thank you for the good talk again. My question continues this East and West discussion of the last Sunday. And you talked a couple of weeks ago about Jesus, and it made me reflect. The thing you mentioned, that Buddha brought teachings of enlightenment, and Jesus taught how to become a good human being rather than an elaborated system of waking up. And I'm thinking of the integral path, where you grow in consciousness as well as in human maturity, etc. And we just recently watched Ken Wilber's interview at the Buddha at the gas pump, where he explained that meditation, transcendence, does not necessarily impact human growth in a psychological development. So Jesus was inspiring to perfect the human idea, whereas Buddha's impulse was how to get enlightened being. And although you said he was very loving and that way expressed the enlightenment, and through Vipassana integrated his transcend self-realization, but there was something very human in Jesus, and he was also calling himself son of human. And years ago, when I had the vision of this logos that you called, I think the one of Nan maybe said about that I have called cosmic logos, I got this sense that this emergent Dharma is exactly about the essence to marry spiritual awakening into deep humanness, and to perfect the humanness rather than just transcend, to like the fully embody instead. So somehow it looks like Buddha's and Jesus' teachings come together. So even there are integral paths in the East, it seems like there is something specific about Jesus' impulse of being spiritual, human in the world, and not of it. So this current time, the path and practice, it looks outwardly very different from traditional path. And since we practice deeply to be engaged in the world, and not just through integral meditation practices such as Vipassana, but in daily action to perfect our qualities, and at the same time try to remove the veils of ignorance by spiritual practice. So it's very hard outwardly. It seems like, isn't it like a deeper marriage of Shiva and Shakti? So would you comment this view or elaborate it a bit in relation to emergent plan of Shambhala? And I'm also thinking of connection to Maitreya's 8th initiation that you talked earlier, and about the tantric phase. This was a long comment, but
it's a good question. Yes, it's actually true. Also, a very big question. So I think, if you don't mind, I will take up that question too after the break in our meditation, because I'd like to address it at length, and we're coming up soon on our break. So thank you for that. Also, I'll engage you some more and clarifying a little bit about what you've asked as part of my response. So we'll come back to that in a little bit. To prepare for, I'm going to kind of shift gears for a few minutes here before the break, and prepare for the meditation a little bit. And then we'll take a break, we'll meditate, and then I'll return to a couple of these questions. In talking about the planetary lineage, one of the natural questions that comes up for people is it useful to try to make contact with these kinds of masters. And of course, that can be useful. That's also a big topic. So we'll in fact come back to that again in greater depth. But at the essence of that methodology is an essential type of practice where if we, say in a meditative context, if we make contact with an inner spirit, an inner reality, we can, there are more sort of impersonal ways to do that. For instance, if we sit and practice being present, even something as grounded and simple as following the breath, then there's a simple reality to a practice like that where we're, say for instance, practicing the capacity to be deeply present, to be content, to be mindful, to have perhaps a loving quality to our state of presence. It can be a kind of quality of loving awareness and peacefulness and other qualities like that. If we're making contact, for instance, with an inner being, and it can be an enlightened being, like an inner teacher, a master, but it can also be some kind of a more universal presence, what's traditionally called a deity. Practices like in Tibetan Buddhism, deity yoga are of this sort. And ultimately, the traditional idea of communion with some kind of universal presence, God or Brahman or the primordial Buddha or something conceived of in this more universal way. In a sense, there's something similar to all of these realities, contacting even our own inner self, our higher self, a master, a deity, or the most universal version of that, a cosmic presence of enlightenment, such as Nirguna Brahman, or actually more, it would be Saguna Brahman in the Hindu tradition, God as a kind of presence. This has a more personal quality to it. There's a lot of ways to go about this. It's an area where we need a lot of caution because our own imagination can come into play, and if we try to engage in the experience of having communications, it's important to be careful about the quality of our contact and the quality of our understanding. But one of the most universal ways to go about the essence of this kind of thing is the practice of Nada Yoga, which is also was called by Blavatsky. She actually used the term Nada as well. She referred to the Nada Bindu Upanishad, which is a Hindu Upanishad that covers this path of the practice of listening to the nada. Nada are internal subtle sounds that aren't human generated, like a human speech or a mantra is a self-generated sound. The nada is a subtle sound. And in its deepest reality, it is the vibratory sound luminosity, you might say, of the state of awakened presence. And there's a way that many lineages have, such as in the way that Blavatsky talked about it, or the way the Sikhs talk about it. In their system, they call Surat Shabd Yoga. Shabd is sound, is another Sanskrit word for sound. It is essentially what's referred to in the New Testament as the Word, or even Logos. one of the meanings of logos is speech or sound, the word. The beginning was the word. In the deepest sense, this is the nada. It's beyond any human language. Like at the deepest levels of God consciousness, we can't put a human word on or name God in a way that is completely comprehensive. But there's a self-sounding name that the transcendental reality has. That is the nada. And we can awaken our ability to hear the nada, this internal sound, and then meditate on it as a way to develop not only transcendental realization, but also, if we so desire, we can cultivate the personal dimension of that, where we're cultivating a communion with an inner presence, a presence of enlightenment. And so in a sense, the nada can be thought of as like a kind of carrier frequency, a vibration, an enlightened vibration through which we can contact our own higher self, attune to and ultimately merge into our own higher self, other inner beings who are part of that luminosity, that sound, and ultimately the most universal expression of that nada, which is God or a primordial Buddha or Ishvara. All of these words are kind of more universal in their connotation. In many traditions, we can give facets of God a name, like a mantra in Hinduism. If we say Shiva or Ram, these are classic names for faces of God, of deities, and you can use them as mantras to come into attunement with them. So one way to contact inner masters and deities is through mantras. Whether they're Sanskrit or not, they can be in whatever sort of ideally a more sacred languages and a more optimal way to work with sound and name or mantra to develop in this way spiritually. What's beautiful and profound about the nada is it transcends human traditions and cultures. It's a universal form of deity yoga, if you will, in that it's learning to hear the sound that this universal presence emanates itself. It's the sound of the vibration of its own state of being and love and realization. It's in a sense, you could say it's God's name, but not a name that humans came up for God. It's God's self-sounding name. So it's learning to spiritually hear the vibration of God's presence. So there's many interesting and somewhat at times more esoteric reasons why this practice has shown up time and again in different spiritual traditions around the world, and is actually a somewhat universal and very beautiful and profound practice. We don't have time at the moment to go into that, so another time, but I'd like to, in our meditation after the break, I'd like to work a little bit with nada yoga. Very often people don't hear this sound, so there's things that we can do in the meantime. So we'll talk about those in the course of the meditation, but I wanted to just take 5 or 10 minutes now to kind of introduce. We've talked about nada yoga a little bit, but I'd like to take this opportunity to go a little deeper into the practice of nada yoga, so that people have that as an option if they feel attracted to it. So let's take our 10-minute break now, then we'll come back and do our meditation. Okay. So, as a matter of fact, I'm going to hold off on the meditation on the nada during the break. I got some input for today do a different meditation. So we'll come back to the nada at another time soon. Sorry. I saw that hand gesture there. So let's begin by going within and taking a moment to get centered, relaxing the body. Extend your awareness throughout your body, feeling yourself more fully incarnate in your whole body. And see your feet and lower legs surrounded by white light, both feeling your lower legs and feet more fully and seeing the white light surrounding, nurturing, and protecting that part of your body. Seeing your legs and hips now surrounded by white light. Feel as you breathe how the light gently vibrates. Feel the vitality in the light. And while seeing your legs and feet surrounded by light, move your awareness into the trunk of your body more strongly now as well. And see the area from your neck to your hips surrounded by white light as well, permeating your body. Feel how the light is both calming, but also gently stimulating, energizing. There's a nurturing and healing energy in this light. And extending your awareness to include your arms more fully now. Your arms and hands surrounded by white light. And moving your awareness into your neck and head. Seeing your neck and head surrounded and permeated by white light. Feel your whole body more fully now. See this loving, harmonizing, and vitalizing white light permeating and surrounding your body. Now particularly see a rose-colored white light radiating from your heart center. At first, just surrounding your chest. It's slowly growing to surround your entire body as a sphere of rose white light, filled with love, goodwill. Let your awareness expand as well. Awareness of your physical body. It's receding a bit now into the background as your consciousness expands. And from your being, continuing to see the rose white light radiating, expanding, so that your awareness grows to the point where you can see the region that you live in below you, and see it bathed in this rose white light. And sense around you others that join you, archangelic beings and spiritual enlightened beings joining you in a spirit of blessing. Your love and light combining to bless the region beyond. Feel the light growing in its scope, extending beyond the area around you to the countryside. And let your awareness expand so that you can see larger and larger regions. Letting the rose white light expand as well, spreading out over larger regions. Wish for harmony and peace in this region. And your awareness continues to expand so that you can see increasingly larger areas of the earth, entire country, and even more countries in the region around you. Till you can see the whole planet. And see the whole planet embraced by this rose white light, surrounded and suffused with the light. Even if you can't quite see or sense the presence of other beings, know that they're with you, whether you're aware of it or not. That your love and intention to bless the earth invokes them always to join in with you. You may even open to feeling sources beyond the earth, pouring a stream of blessings through you and the others, and into the earth, surrounding the earth. Wish for greater love and harmony in the world. Now feel your awareness moving back towards your body, moving back towards a more complete connection and centeredness in your physical body. Also gently bringing back with you stronger grounding of this energy in your body, in your chakras, so that they continue to have positive influence on the world around you. Focus on feeling the solidity in your body, the sense of the contact of your body, surface that your body's resting on. Be aware of the physical environment around you. Feel the sphere of your awareness and energy coming back to a field immediately around your body, consolidated, grounded, integrated. And when ready, open your eyes. So, Nina brought up a question that's, as she indicated, is essentially in some ways a continuation of some discussion from the last week and earlier weeks about the relationship between, different spiritual masters in the world and their corresponding lineages. For me, it's part of that larger question of, as we move towards a more universal, integral planetary lineage, what light does that shed on the existing traditions in the world and the different masters, historical personalities that are connected to these lineages, and what is their relationship to the emergent Dharma? And in my experience, this is actually a pretty complicated question. Perhaps the most basic response would be to say that, of course, there's a way in which all of the traditions in the world make a contribution, that there's a kind of fullness to global spirituality that's enriched by every tradition. At the same time, there is a sense that there is a kind of ancient depth and richness to the spirituality in some regions of the world, particularly places like China and India, whose spirituality seems, and the masters connected with those lineages seem to have a very ancient and seminal influence on the current cycle. So we see this in some of the teachings in different esoteric traditions, for instance, of this, saying, for instance, the notion of the founding of a fifth major cycle and how that took place in India, or the notion that there's a planetary center, like, as it's called by some in Asia, Shambhala. Why is that located in that part of the world, and what does that mean in terms of the religions that are spiritual traditions and culture that's intimately connected with that region, versus different forms of spirituality that have emerged throughout the world? In many ways, that's a question that's similar to the notion of, say, a chakra in the body. Our whole body is important, and yet there are focal points in the body where there's a concentration of different kinds of energy and from which it's distributed. So many people have suggested that the nature of Shambhala is not that it's a kind of a place where there's a consolidation of energy in a kind of restricted way, where it's focused there and not elsewhere, but rather it's a kind of distribution center. In some ways, not unlike, also another parallel I think that's useful to draw is the relationship between the soul as an incarnating individuality and its incarnations. We even see many instances of the notion that's just talked about in places from Theosophy to the Hindu tradition, and certainly a great deal in Tibetan Buddhism, that a soul can even have, especially more advanced bodhisattvas, can have more than one personality, emanation, and incarnation at the same time. In a sense, that might be one way to think about Shambhala, is that it's a sense of kind of chakra and focal point for the soul of the planet. And then it has emanations that are simultaneously in incarnation throughout the world. And there are those traditions that happen to be particularly intimately connected to that center by geography, like, for instance, the Himalayan traditions and the Indian traditions, and kind of around that whole region, even into China and so on. So what does that mean? What does that mean about, say, the Egyptian traditions and the other Middle Eastern traditions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, the Greek mysteries, the Native American traditions, the African traditions, Australian Aborigines? How does that all fit together? Is there some incompleteness to the traditions that are located geographically closer to Shambhala, for instance, versus other ones in the world? They sort of complete each other. Well, one way to look at it would be to say that they complement each other. There's some, each one is like a partial expression. That doesn't seem, though, to be the actual teachings that the masters that are part of that tradition gave out. They didn't describe their sense of the ancient sort of fifth cycle spirituality in its home base in that region of the world as an incomplete dharma, and that the other traditions in the world were other pieces of that dharma. To my view, there actually, of course, is a way in which that is true, because anytime you create an emanation in some other location, that's a unique individualized expression of the core, the source lineage, and it's going to have its own unique experiences and wisdom and so on. At the same time, though, to use the parallel of the higher self and its many emanations, the nature of the way the higher self functions is it's not really like one incarnation as opposed to other incarnations. It's the source, it's the integrative source behind all the incarnations. So Shambhala, for instance, is a place where the fruits of all its emanations are integrated into its essential nature, so that the spirit of one spirituality, one dharma, one planet is deeply realized in Shambhala, and all of the different expressions are integrated there. So my experience is that what we see in part in Indian spirituality is sort of two realities at the same time. It's that location in the world that's been closest to Shambhala, and so in many ways has expressed the fullest richness of the Dharma. And so, for instance, we do in fact see that even though we can look at other traditions in the world, like, say, the Native American, and say, well, there's a big piece there that they have that, say, your average Westerner actually doesn't seem to be as deeply connected to, which is profound earth-centered, intuitive attunement, a kind of spirituality of nature mysticism, a deep connection to the nature kingdoms, the elements, and the earth as a whole. Of course, there's aspects of Western spirituality that include that component, but it seems to generally be more highly developed in certain traditions like African shamanism or the Australian traditions, the indigenous Australian traditions, or the Native American traditions, especially certain ones. And yet, if we look at the masters, the great hidden masters that have existed in India for thousands of years, they're very tantrically integrated masters who have a profound connection to their bodies, to nature, a full mastery of the elements. They express enormous compassion and love. They're bodhisattvas. They've made a commitment to stay with the earth, in many cases, for thousands of years past the point where they would need to leave. So there's this, many, many thousands of year old tradition in India of ancient rishis, sages, and bodhisattvas who continue to stay with the earth and express a profound love and concern and service to humanity. So in that sense, the beauty of, say, the Native American tradition, relative to some of the other expressions of spirituality in the world, certainly has its own unique contribution. And many traditions can learn a lot from that. And yet we have great masters in places like China, Tibet, and India who also have a profound expression of that already integrated into their spirituality. Similarly, we have traditions like Christianity that emphasize love, and yet, again, when we look at many of these great masters in India, and not just the hidden masters themselves, but in many of these traditions, the Neem Kroli Babas and the Dilgo Kenseis, these are extraordinarily loving and compassionate beings who don't necessarily, in a sense, need to take an incarnation in the West and be exposed to Christianity to learn about that quality. It's already not only deeply expressed in their tradition, but profoundly actualized in their own individual spirituality. So on one level, there's a way in which these different aspects of the world traditions do complement each other. Excuse me. At the same time, there is a type of spirituality that already exists in the world that has a fairly strong concentration in certain parts of the world, probably because that's where Shambhala is, where a deep synthesis of these aspects and qualities and perspectives has been going on for thousands of years and is fairly well embodied there. Does that mean that that tradition has nothing to learn, that there's no, certainly not. My philosophy, there are some who kind of lean towards what might be called traditionalism, or even kind of a notion of a kind of descending quality to civilization. By that I mean not so much of, well, the meaning here of descending is that civilization as a whole and spirituality to some extent is decreasing in some ways in the world. And so there was an ancient Dharma that was known to the great spiritual traditions all around the world, say, many tens of thousands of years ago. And some traditions teach that we lost that, we've come down from that, and that the Dharma that's in the world today is fragmented and incomplete and less profoundly expressed. And so from that point of view, we're trying to sustain and recapture something that was lost. That's kind of a more descending perspective. Personally, my experience is there's some degree of truth in that. At the same time, I see more of an ascending pattern in the world. My feeling is that the spirituality in the world has been maturing in another sense for thousands of years. And if we compare, say, the philosophies of certain parts of the world, whether it's the Middle East or in Europe or in China or India, say several thousand years ago from the evidence that we have, and then look at, a few thousand years later and then a few thousand years later, in many ways it seems to be maturing. It's becoming more complete, more whole, more fully human, more compassionate, more wise, deeper philosophical understanding, greater depths of realization. So that's the point of view that I think is probably more true personally, and I don't see any reason that should stop. It will just continue. I think that the general expression of spirituality in the world will continue to become more and more enlightened as the ages pass, and that's part of what I mean. Why I kind of speak of the spirit of emergent spirituality is it's in that vein. It's something that I feel is essentially a natural unfoldment. The Dharma is always maturing and deepening in the world. And, perhaps in some very ancient time, there was some other previous cycle that reached some apex of human evolution and expression, where there was a golden age, an ancient golden age of spirituality, the Satya Yuga, as the Hindus still talk about, and also in various Buddhist traditions, the same kind of notion of various cycles like this. Maybe there was some even more integral, more profound, more rich spirituality at that time. We don't really have, that's more on the level of kind of esoteric lore in these traditions, though. We don't really have very good evidence that was the case, because the history that we have available to us on a more ordinary human level doesn't really seem to speak to that very clearly. I think there's for instance, to me, the notion of a more non-dual and tantric spirituality is a richer, more complete type of spirituality. That seems to have gradually arose in the last few thousand years. And that if we look at some of the more ancient traditions that are more like 2,500, 3,500 years old, they're not quite as tantric and non-dual in their spirit. So the evidence historically that I feel like we see is progress. So we're going to continue to make progress. I think that we could say, well, 1,000 years from now, if we were to look at the trans-Himalayan lineages teachings, or teachings about other great lineages in places like China and the Middle East, and Sri Guru Babaji's lineage, as irreverent as it might sound, I think that we'll see that there's been growth, maturing, an increased richness and depth of enlightenment. And not in a way that somehow fundamentally contradicts some of the basic principles. The spiritual traditions of the world have recognized certain universal truths for a long time and throughout many cultures, the reality of some fundamental transcendent reality, a God or a grounded being, an absolute or a suchness that is profoundly inclusive and transcendental. a reality that human beings can cultivate, a realization of that. We can cultivate wisdom and spiritual qualities, and ultimately a deep intuitive realization of our true nature and the absolute. So there's many kind of basic truths like that, but our specific ways of going about that are the details of how we interpret it all. All of that, I believe, has been growing and expanding and deepening over the centuries and millennia. So that's in that spirit. Of course, it has to be the case that we'll be able to look back, and even now, I think that it's possible to kind of examine the various teachings around the world and critique them in that light. Is there some emergent dharma? You know, people like Aurobindo, even Blavatsky, Ken Wilber, and a variety of other people that are more or less kind of attuned to the sense of a deeper dharma and an emergent dharma. And my feeling is they're definitely truths. Sometimes what we find, though, is that people will, in their sort of enthusiasm to understand a kind of new spirituality, people sometimes reinvent the wheel. They, maybe in the context of a certain spiritual tradition, they discover that something's missing. And they don't realize that in another part of the world, that wisdom has been known for 2,000 years. So that in that sense, it's new to one region of the world. It's not new to it. It's new to one tradition, for instance, but not new to another. So to kind of have a richer understanding of what's developing, kind of need to have a broader sense of the reality of the different traditions around the world. Aurobindo, for instance, essentially got onto the tantric idea. He didn't end up calling it that until later in his life, but his way of describing the reality of supermind was very tantric in its quality, and essentially described the difference of a shift from a more traditional to a more tantric perspective. And then later in his life, he began to realize that there were other masters. For instance, he specifically referenced Ramalinga and pointed out and realized, oh, I guess actually this is something that tantric traditions already know about. And so what he realized was it's not so much that he was understanding a new spirituality per se, but rather that he was attuned to the spirit of that type of spirituality was going to become more prevalent in the world. So it's not, for instance, that Tantra is a new idea, but rather that Tantra is something that larger numbers of people are becoming more aware of and more inspired by and more intuitively resonant with as a point of view, whether you call it Tantra or something else. In many ways, I feel like that's also true of some of these ancient traditions in the world, not only the hidden masters behind the scenes, but also some of the more mature expressions of those lineages in the world, like Taoism, tantric forms of Hinduism, and Tibetan Buddhism. In many ways, those are kind of cutting-edge traditions that already have a very profoundly cultivated balance of masculine and feminine, Shiva and Shakti, love and wisdom, the engaged aspect and the deeply meditative and internal aspect, form, emptiness and form. There's a whole kind of spectrum of different kinds of polarities and dimensions to human nature and reality that can be integrated. Now, are those perfectly expressed in those traditions? I think not. I think more so in some than in others. For instance, if it was more fully and profoundly expressed as it could be in a tradition, let's say like Tibetan Buddhism, there would be less of a historical tendency in Tibetan Buddhism to favor male practitioners. So that, in a sense, is a clear indication that it's one thing to have a deep realization that may have not only developed in your inner being, but integrated into your life in many ways. And then there's still areas that it hasn't integrated in your culture or in individual practitioners' lives. So that's something that many people are addressing right now. There's a lot of literature coming out, especially amongst Western practitioners of Tibetan Buddhism, about the feminine, about the empowerment of the feminine. Women like Sultram Allione are very focused in this direction. There's a slew of wonderful books about the Dakini principle and so on and so forth in Tibetan Buddhism. So we see both that there's a profound intuitive wisdom about these truths, and then there's always areas to keep growing in how we express those realities. So generally, one of the cutting edge dimensions I see in which almost all of these traditions, East or West, indigenous, or some of the meditative traditions and so on and so forth from them, there's a kind of universal need to be more gender balanced, not necessarily in the philosophy or even in the inner realization of it, but in the full embrace culturally of the lineages. That's not been historically as much. For instance, in Tibetan Buddhism, another well-known female Tibetan Buddhist practitioner, an English woman, Tenzin Palmo, said that when in the 60s she went to places like India and in the Himalayan region and to seek out Tibetan Buddhist teachers, she had a hard time finding teachers that would teach her as a woman. It took her a while to find a teacher. Now, times keep changing and people have encountered a lot more modern students and Western students. So one of the influences is not so much the spiritual traditions as I see it. Part of what's really influencing the changes in the Dharma in the world is bringing the Dharma into new contexts where the culture is different. So for instance, the greater gender equality in many cultures in the world, the greater scientific awareness, greater psychological sophistication, integrating the Dharma into those contexts is enriching the Dharma. And the Dharma enriches those as well. There's dimensions to psychological understanding that Western psychology is still not fully up to speed about. So there's a kind of cross-fertilization of psychologies going on there. But it's very empowering to both. So in this way, it's hard for me to kind of make sweeping generalizations about exactly what's happening in terms of the maturing of the Dharma in the world. It's a multifaceted and complex process. And one of the ways that that's taking place is a kind of mixing together of traditions. For me, Christianity, for instance, is not a tradition that I experience as necessarily having sort of holding the key to love, and that other traditions need to learn that from Christianity, for instance. Some do. I think one of the ways in which traditions can be different is they emphasize different qualities, and so there's a kind of counterbalancing that goes on in that regard. Personally, I feel that probably the reason that Jesus' teachings emphasize love is that he incarnated into a part of the world where the number of advanced spiritual practitioners wasn't as strongly expressed. There's just simple reality that I think it's very much like the chakra idea. There's a kind of a basic spiritual principle that in cultivating enlightenment, both within an individual or within the world around us, that the first step is to awaken spirituality, awaken the vision of the Dharma, say in the individual, for instance. And then that becomes, that awakened energy is not fully integrated throughout the person. So first it awakens somewhere, like in an individual. Let's say if you do a meditation in the Ajna Center or in the Heart Center, and that's kind of key focus of your spiritual practice, it's as if you're centering the awakening around that location and trying to focus it there and consolidate it there, and then it spreads from that place throughout the rest of your being. This is a common thing. Like, for instance, if we discover the ability in day-to-day life or in meditation to have a more awakened part of us that can be aware and mindful of our day-to-day lives and look at how we behave and what our motives are and things like this. Basic dynamic of that, basic element of that experience is we have one part that's more awake, and then the influence of that part kind of spreads throughout the whole being. So, for instance, if a one part develops a deepening intuitive discrimination about the value of being loving and kind, the only reason that we have that ideal at all in our minds is because it's not fully integrated. If it was fully integrated, we would be in that place, and there wouldn't even be any value in reflecting on love and discriminating about love. It's because we're learning to grow that love, to spread that love throughout our nature, that we even discriminate about it in the first place. So each spiritual quality is a dimension of awakening. Spiritual truths like Buddha nature are a kind of vision of an intuitive sensibility that we awaken to, and then we integrate it throughout our nature. And so we could say that first there's a kind of center of being in our nature, whether we think of it as located in our body somewhere or more as some part of our consciousness, that first gets it, that first awakens, and then it grows from there, it spreads from there. The same thing is true geographically in the world. There are what sometimes people call like strongholds. It's kind of like the reason that there are places like ashrams and spiritual centers. They're places to consolidate the Dharma, to become absorbed into a concentrated experience of the Dharma, and then you go back out into the world. You go back to your life again. You carry that energy and you try to integrate it there. But you go there for inspiration. It's like, in one sense, Shambhala is the core of the Dharma as a located stronghold of the pure vibration of the planetary Dharma on our planet. And then it spreads from there. It's integrated to the rest of the planet from that place. And so geographically, it's historically been the case that in this cycle, since for this cycle, Shambhala is located where it is in Asia, it's had its strongest expressions of integration immediately around it, because that's where it's located. But it ultimately needs to spread to embrace the entire planet, as well as all of humanity and all of human culture. And every experiment, every process of expressing its emanation and integration into different parts of the world enhances the Dharma, enhances the fruits of the Dharma, which is still ultimately consolidated in Shambhala. That's where those fruits are most integrally realized. Christianity, for me, for instance, is a particular emanation of the Dharma from Shambhala that took the form it did because of the part of the world that it was expressed in. But one of the reasons that it didn't become the same as, say, Taoism or Buddhism, in that both of those are examples of profoundly vital living traditions that sustained an expression of an understanding of how to realize Christ consciousness. So that, for instance, in the context of Taoism, we have 2,500 years of great Taoist masters arising in an unbroken lineage of transmission. The Middle East was a much more difficult environment to express the Dharma in, so it didn't lead to that. Christ's incarnation did not. It's believed by many people, like Daskalos, for instance, that in fact Jesus did, to his inner circle, teach very advanced spiritual practices. But because the time wasn't ripe in the Middle East to receive those teachings, they didn't become a living tradition. So we don't have any, in the case of someone like Daskalos, he had to re-reveal those practices from subtler planes back into the world because they were lost. There's no living tradition expressing those. But those lineages that are closer to Shambhala had the purpose and the nature to have a more intimate connection to the source of the planetary Dharma. And so in those parts of the world, we have this much more rich and integral and sustained transmission. Now, it's true in every tradition, there are less mature expressions of the Dharma. So that, for instance, within, say, Hinduism, there are some yogis that aren't very interested in a balanced integral path. We see that in China, we see that in the Middle East, we see that actually in all parts of the world. Every tradition has elements like that. And in some ways, some of the early encounters Westerners had with Asian traditions kind of led many people to imagine that, well, this is a very unintegrated part of the world. They were navel gazers. They were caught up in their own inner peace. They had no interest in the world. They were interested in going off into higher worlds and all these kinds of things. And what we've learned over the last couple of centuries, gradually through a much deeper familiarity with these actual traditions, is there's a much richer spectrum of different kinds of masters and practitioners and whole sort of lineages within these traditions. And all different kinds of possibilities were represented, but the general spirit in traditions like, say, Taoism, is that they're very integrated traditions. Taoism isn't an otherworldly tradition. It's very much attuned to nature. There's a deep perception and appreciation of the spirit that enlightenment is something that needs to be profoundly integrated with the body, with nature. This is fundamental recognition of the balance of the masculine and the feminine, of yin and yang. There's a deep connection to culture and appreciation of the importance of the integration of spirituality into human culture. So that doesn't fit at all the sort of caricatures that are often portrayed of like Eastern spirituality as being otherworldly and disengaged and lacking in compassion and selfish and a lot of these kinds of essentially mischaracterizations. You can find specific examples in every tradition, East and West, of people that have these different qualities. For instance, certainly among Christian mystics, there's been a couple thousand years of a variety of types of Christian mystics who were exceedingly ascetic, who were very world-denying, very oriented towards coming close to God as something that was experienced only internally, and that the goal was to commune with God and gain favor with God in order to gain entrance into heaven, which was somewhere else. And that the royal path to doing that was not only devotion to God, but profound denial of nature, the body, desire, and the world. And so they isolated themselves from culture, became very ascetic, even to the point of extremes of self-denial. And we see strong presence of these qualities in say the Jewish tradition. The Essenes were extremely ascetic. For instance, I've met practitioners of Orthodox Judaism in this life who were very extreme in their asceticism. They were householders who didn't believe that it was appropriate at all for males and females to have sexual contact with each other than procreation. And they had very sort of traditional, very polarized views on the way to be in the world and the way the sexes interact and so on and so forth. So this a concept of very kind of traditional, polarized, even extremely ascetic forms of spirituality we see in the Native American tradition, we see in the ancient Greeks. Not everybody in any of these cultures is like that, but it's easy to find examples not only in Asia, but within the context of every tradition that I'm familiar with. So I think we're in a phase now in terms of understanding world spiritualities, integral spirituality, the Shambhala culture, and especially the sort of relationship between different traditions. We're in a new phase now where we're becoming more familiar with both the spirit of an integral spirituality and the place, a kind of way to view the strengths and weaknesses of different traditions in that context. And as I've said, in my view, it's certainly true that there's a need to mature all of the traditions. I'll especially, for instance, in the next webinar, I will be critiquing some of the various points of view as a way of kind of clearing the way into a more balanced vision of essential mysticism, of non-dual mysticism, as well as Tantra and a kind of general sort of integral and global spirituality. I think it's important to look at some of the different teachings around the world, Eastern and Western, and evaluate them in that context to sort of clarify, what is the emergent Dharma? Why is it new? What about it is actually, it's kind of like Aurobindo, what about it is actually old, in the sense that it's insights that have developed and some of them have been around for 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years. Some of them are somewhat fresher, and in most cases, there's still a spirit in which even those insights that have emerged in the past are kind of getting richer and more full and mature in their understanding, and our understanding and embodiment of them, particularly. I see. Let's see. Indeed. So let's, I don't know how much I've touched upon your question. Gonna unmute here, Lena, but I want to touch back in now and just see if there's what I've missed and further comments or questions pertaining to that theme.
Well, I think I thank you so much. I leave it for now because it's late and maybe other people want to ask. So, yeah, okay. I will not have further comments. Maybe later at some point. I have many thoughts and comments, but I don't think there's time now. So thank you so much for this.
You're welcome. Yeah, there's a lot to say. It's really a huge topic, and an important one. In a certain sense, I feel like it's perhaps most foundationally useful to emphasize that all of the different spiritual traditions in the world that we've been talking about. Let's see, hang on, I should mute again. Are expressions in their own way of the Shambhala lineage, and that the more we go into the deeper, more esoteric side of spiritual traditions, we tend to be surprised to find a richness there that's greater and more balanced and integral than we imagined. For instance, if it's true what Daskalos teaches us about Christ's teachings, which I suspect is true. I have a fairly strong resonance actually with his, not only many aspects of his teachings, but his sense that, he feels that he, through studying the Akashic records, through his own memories of being an incarnation at that time, and also his ongoing relationship with Yohanan, who was a sort of kind of main transmitter of the Christian doctrine, that he's received a very rich, he received in that incarnation as Daskalos a very rich understanding of the more esoteric teachings that Jesus taught, especially to the Essenes, but to his disciples, his inner disciples in general. And looking at those teachings, some of them are things that Daskalos added, like the Christian Kabbalah. It doesn't seem like the Kabbalah was an aspect of Jesus' teachings, and he, in fact, Daskalos says that it was later, it was Origen who kind of integrated the Kabbalah into Christianity. So that aspect of Daskalos' teachings, excuse me, I don't think reflects Jesus's teachings, but the richness there is actually pretty extraordinary, including that it incorporates breathing practices, which people tend to think of as a more Asian thing, in the sense that in Qigong, in Tibetan Buddhism, in aspects of the Hindu tradition, from Raja Yoga to Hatha Yoga, there are very sophisticated systems of breathing practice that can play a very profound role in purification and transformation, even within the tantric traditions. But Daskalos claims that sophisticated and advanced forms of breathing practices were taught by Jesus to his disciples. And the kind of wisdom and clarity that obviously not only comes through the New Testament, but also is magnified, I think, significantly by the teachings that Daskalos claimed came through Jesus, I would say makes Jesus a profoundly wise person. Certain kinds of bhakti saints, for instance, that are very devotional and very wonderful in their spiritual maturity and depth. But I don't think it's unfair to say, well, they kind of lean towards maybe the more, the less esoteric or the less sophisticated in terms of the richness of the teachings. So, for instance, in the Satmat lineage, Darshan was an amazing master and saint, but you didn't find complex teachings about things like the different elements and the rays and chakras, and he was generally aware of some of these things, but he didn't seem, for instance, to have the same kind of richness that, say, we find in a tradition like Raja Yoga or Tibetan Buddhism or Daskalos' teachings. So some people might be inclined to look at the life of Jesus and think that he was kind of a bhakti saint. But in fact, I think that he was much more balanced and integral master who had a highly developed wisdom side, and actually also was a very esoterically rich master who had a sophisticated understanding of a sort of esoteric energy systems, chakras, and worked with practices like breathing practices to master these energies. And so it was but unfortunately, some of the early Western esotericists chose the name occult to talk about the kind of traditions that kind of lean this way. That turned out to be an unfortunate choice of words because it's evolved into meaning something quite different now. But we could call it esoteric or even kind of scientific, a Yanni approach, all of that, the sort of richness of the spiritual technology. Seems like the impression I get from my own intuition and from sources like Daskalos is Jesus was actually very rich in that way, and the only reason it didn't come down to us is because it didn't get the environment that Jesus incarnated into wasn't right for a strong tradition to emerge, embodying that and sustaining that understanding in the world. So there's, as we said, there's a lot more we could say about all of that, but we'll move towards winding down now. I did see, though, that Hans Christian has a question, so why don't we take that, and then we can wind up.
Well, thank you.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to touch a little more upon what you talked about in the first part. Well, actually, I have so many things I would touch upon, but it's very limited time. But first of all, you mentioned about the balance between how much to engage in pushing development and how much to lean back, and we can take that into very concrete in our lives. How much do we want to engage in activism and be in the forefront and you know, make people aware that we are in a period of time where we need to wake up and we need to be more aware of what's going on. And humanity is in a crisis and so forth. Or we can choose to have this, and this is where I find myself in a bit of a limbo, maybe, because our lineage is perhaps a little more like, not leaning back, let's say, but they're working.
When you say our lineage, you mean like the emergent Western lineage, or the trans-Himalayan lineage, or?
Yeah, more the trans-Himalayan lineage.
Is more leaning back?
Yeah, or they're working in the background, so they're not their progress or their work to influence humanity is not so visible to everybody. So it's for me I find it difficult to find the balance between how much to actually engage in being more active, and how much to accept that actually this process will take not decades but centuries. So how much to actually, you know, waste energy on trying to wake up people who are not really there to hear the message.
It's a good question. One of the themes that the question, I think, engages is, what does it actually mean to be engaged? But does it look a specific way? For instance, if masters are behind the scene, does that mean they're leaning towards being less engaged? I would say not, because it really depends on the master. Some might be that way, but many of these masters are deeply engaged in action in the world. It's just not visible to humanity. But that doesn't mean that they're not very balanced in the sort of inner, you know, the sort of introspective or meditative aspect of their nature versus the engaged or active aspect of their nature. For instance, if you look at the life of someone like Maheshwanath Babaji, he was very deeply in his body and constantly active, doing things, very, very engaged. And then you can compare him to, say, the Dalai Lama and say, well, he's similarly very engaged, and yet he's visible in the world. Well, in a certain sense, there's really no difference. The only difference is the perceptual one of, like, well, one we know about and the other we didn't know about until Sri M told us about him. But that doesn't mean that in the balance of their nature, that Maheshwanath was less engaged in the world. In fact, I think you could actually make an argument that some of these masters are more engaged than any person who's out in the world is actively, because they're in the depth of their non-dual realization, which is what marries the two, is so profound,
right?
That the degree to which their presence and their activity impacts the world is more profound than politicians would be.
Yeah, and that leads me to another part of the question, which is when would you expect that humanity, like in a broader scale, not just esotericists like us, who are nerds into all these things, but more on a broad scale, that actually humanity become aware of these wise beings that are working behind the scenes. I know the theme of reappearance of the hierarchy and so forth, but let's just bring it into a more modern context. That we are on the brink, it seems, of like the leadership in the world is like led by dinosaurs, and they it seems like they have to go extinct very quickly or very soon, because they are bringing down the whole world and the climate. And I think the climate is a super good example of showing what the state of the situation is. That actually we are on the brink of a catastrophe. And so there must be some urgency also in the levels of the hierarchy or those ascended masters, that they are aware that there's a need, there's an urgent need for a more full awakening of humanity, and a very concrete awakening, not a transcendent levels, but simply a knowledge about that there's more to this world than just, having a job and fulfilling one's own needs. But there's actually a spiritual realm, which is spiritual because we don't know what it is. It's not concrete to most people, but if we knew more about these hidden masters and their work, could engage in that work too, and support them and so forth.
Yes.
What do you think? Is it going to be like that, or are we going more like down the cliff first?
I'm kind of a diehard optimist, so I always have hope. At the same time, I try to be realistic and look at the karmic situation of the world. And it's kind of like, it's another way to look at the chakras, that their meaning is, if you look at the world out of your, say, Ajna center all the time, you're very idealistic, because that's a kind of a realm of spiritual values and the Dharma as a sort of possibility and an ideal. But it's through our lower chakras that we feel the reality of the karmic situation of the world. Where's my personality at? Where's the world at? Where's the culture at? Where's politics, and so on? So to have a full understanding, we have, in a sense, we have to use all of our chakras to feel the total situation. If we err too much towards our solar plexus, for instance, then we'll see a dog-eat-dog world where there's nothing but ambition and greed and competitiveness and violence and so on. But if we also only see the world from this place, it's all love and light, and we're about to all turn into, like some part of the New Age world that I've been, tangentially aware of for decades now, that I've had people tell me, by 2012, the whole world's going to turn into light, and the world's going to, we're all going to take our rainbow bodies. And I'm thinking, what planet do you live on? Like, feel with your whole being the reality of the world situation. So there's a kind of koan in how to balance that. How's that all going to work out? There's profound spiritual resources within humanity and supporting humanity in the earth that I think can make a great difference in the healing and regeneration of the earth. But there's also just the reality of, like, where are we at and how fast can we grow and in what direction is it going right now? I'm optimistic, hopeful, like maybe is an even better word. But I'm also, I think it's important to have that whole point of view, to be equanimous and to be open to all the possibilities. And so that's why I make reference to, there are possible scenarios that I've seen and other people have seen where it does go downhill. I think it's quite possible that it won't. But I think for our humanness, we need to live in a world where there's that concern that it might. We have to step up. We have to be as present and alert and engaged as we can be with the world situation. It's one of those moments where it really matters. So I think we don't want to lull ourselves into, oh, it's just going to be all fine. That's not what it feels like to me. It feels like there's a sense of urgency. That's one of the reasons why. It's interesting, like, I know that you've read the Sri M's autobiography several times. There's that wonderful moment when they awaken his Kundalini in that very dramatic and intense way. And they use the phrase, we have to do this because we don't have time.
Yeah.
There's a sense of urgency. I believe the same spirit was behind why the Theosophical Society was created, even though it was acknowledged that it maybe wasn't fully right, but we still have to try. See what we can do. We'll try the Krishnamurti situation. Alice Bailey tried to form seed groups and wrote letters to people and envisioned the future schools and tried. Findhorn, Oroville, all these things, around the world people are trying. Some of it's working out okay, some of it's not working out so well, some of it's working out very well. But my feeling is the hierarchy is intensely active right now. They're extremely engaged in the world, and there's a tremendous, but they also have to be careful to not over-energize the world, because their presence is very powerful. People really have no idea how much Shakti is there, how much dynamic energy and vitality and consciousness is. And they have to be very careful to moderate how much of that just gets released into the world. That's one of the reasons they're behind the scenes, is that it moderates the energy, because it could cause problems, a variety of different kind of problems in the world, if their presence was more fully known or more fully engaged in the world. So there's a balancing act that's there, that's going on. So in the end, I'm hopeful. I think part of the work of people like us who are on this side of the veil, so to speak, we're not behind the scenes types, is to draw on that inspiration and then do what we can, discover what we resonate with, even if it's just pursuing a spiritual path. Each of us is interconnected with the world, and as we clean up our own backyard, as we heal and integrate and express more love and harmony and peace in our own personalities, that influences the world around us. And then if we feel called to have that overflow into some kind of additional, even if it's, the kind of meditation we did today of sharing light with the world, there's infinite ways to bless the world, to participate in the world. And people can discover what they're inspired to do in that way. And that, to me, is one of the values of a relationship with the hidden lineage, so to speak, is that they kind of specialize in helping people find that optimal place, that optimal contribution. But because we're at an early stage of that lineage's expression in the world, that science and art is not as well developed as it could be. So a lot of people feel like they're still searching for that place of where to make a contribution. So that's another theme. We'll come back to that again, but that's one of the implications of a relationship to the planetary lineage, is how do we work with and discover our own dharma, our own nature and contribution. So I think we're getting along in time. It's a great topic, and we could go on with that some more. I think I might have seen one other quick question flash up, maybe just a statement. Yes, when the time is right, that will certainly be the case. I do suspect, my experience, by the way, with regard to that, the masters coming out to that is still the plan. In other words, one of the things that causes me to feel a strong sense of inspiration and hope is that when I engage in attunement to the plan. A lot of these basic trends have not changed. There's still an emergent dharma being energized. There's still so-called gradual education of humanity and the emergence of the hidden masters into the world. That is the plan. It's being acted on gradually. There are projects to heal the divisions between, not only within the human kingdom, but the split between the Shambhala and humanity, and between humanity and nature. The fact that these projects are still fully being energized by the hierarchy is one way to talk about the reality that they haven't given up hope. They don't think, oh, okay, we have to switch gears now. It's a sinking ship. It's a whole no strategy. That's not what I experience as what's going on. So for now, it's still moving ahead with that vision. And I have a lot of reason to feel, I believe in my own experience, that can work out. Although it's definitely a difficult time period. Yes, there's many great beings coming into the world now. And, Tamara, thank you for mentioning that. Okay, well, looks like a good time to wind up. Thank you all for coming. I'm also working on an announcement for the next webinar. I hope to come out with that in the next few days. So I will email that out soon. And thank you all for coming. I look forward to seeing you all next week.